Okay, on to part two of techniques we can use for rendering. Before we get to the nitty-gritty of brushes and different things that we can sort of use to create these gradients and things like that, I want to just talk about two extra concepts that of sort of lighting that come into play a lot, that are kind of worthwhile. In the same way that core light is, it's kind of good to understand the difference between these sort of two things and how they're gonna interplay. So you've seen the basic concept of sort of different faces of an object and how we show form by considering the lighting. But when we're kind of drawing these boxes, it's kind of very obvious to see what's sort of a cast shadow and kind of how that cast shadow comes into play. But when we're dealing with scenarios where we're actually sort of painting a thing, we're actually sort of painting some sort of art, frequently the difference between a cast shadow and a form shadow is sort of really important. It's important to make this distinction and kind of understand the difference. So I just got, this is a little demo that we've done for a different class in a previous sort of class. And the task is basically take this, like draw a face and sort of just do some very simple shading from different light sources. So you can kind of get a feel for how the same form might look if you render it using a different light source. And I might punch up the contrast a bit so you can just kind of see this stuff a little bit better. So cast shadow versus form shadow, they're different in the way that they sort of look and feel, and basically the shapes that are created on faces and natural forms and all sorts of things are often sort of made up of this concept of like a cast shadow versus a form shadow, and it's important to kind of understand the difference. And the difference basically is that if we look at sort of this shadow here is representing form. It's representing sort of this face here, which is in the light, is sort of receding into the shadow, and there's a form change there. And if we kind of get some colors again so we can make it really obvious. So this kind of contour here, right? This is kind of like a major sort of contour of the face. And basically what we're doing by changing the value here is to say that this is where the form kind of changes. It goes from here to here. So this is kind of fairly simple. And again, this is very similar to what we'd sort of have if we're rendering boxes and stuff. But this shadow here, or this kind of change in value here, is not a form change. As you would know, like looking at the face, we understand faces, we know exactly how they work. This is not a form change. This is a shadow cast by this form. So we have a form of a nose, kind of here. And again, we've kind of got different sort of bits of that form. And you can see here, sort of this change in value here is representing form change. It's kind of showing a sort of gradient going along. But this one here is not. It's a cast shadow, and it's cast by the nose because the light is going this way. And the real difference is that form shadows are kind of soft frequently because they're sort of, unless it's a hard edge, but often if you're dealing with these kind of organic surfaces, the real way it comes into play and the way that it makes a big difference to your art is that frequently organic surfaces, which is kind of everything that's not sort of buildings and cars and things that are, sort of man-made, and even things which are man-made that are kind of organic, anything that's not sort of geometric planar surfaces frequently has this thing where we will see gradients, which represent sort of smooth surfaces being rendered. And then we'll have a hard line, which represents a cast shadow. And this is just basically kind of how that works is you get this kind of hard line here. And you can see it's going to sort of crop up in other places too. So that it sounds kind of subtle, but I would just watch out for it. Just watch out for it. And the kind of real number one sort of rookie mistake is kind of making this shadow sort of too soft, making the cast shadows too soft, and not understanding just how these two things are different, because they're still shadow, and everything kind of here is going to be in shadow, but the shadow is kind of showing different things. And it's important to understand that when we view this, we kind of understand that objects cast shadows and we expect them to cast shadows, so we kind of don't see the weirdness of this, of kind of having this weird dark shape here. But it's definitely sort of a thing. So and it's just this kind of in the same way like having like your lighting set up well, so that you've got like good differentiation between your different sides of an object, so that the form is reading really well. Having a good interplay of cast shadow versus form shadow is really important, because cast shadow gives us this nice crisp edge, whereas form shadow gives us this nice kind of smooth transition. And the combination of those is really nice, basically because it has a lot of contrast in it instinctively. Just kind of naturally has a lot of contrast built in. So it's good to kind of understand the difference, and basically just always think like, okay, there's sort of shadow here, but is it there's dark value here in something I'm observing, or I kind of know, I'm pretty sure, there's some stuff here, but what is it? Like, make the distinction. And the more that you can kind of break those sort of down and understand them, the better. So very, very simple concept, but it'll come up a lot. The other one is a thing called, so again, this is just to kind of put some names to it. This is kind of form shadow, and this one is shadow. So this is the showing form, and this is showing a shadow which is cast by an object. They're both of them are kind of shading. They're both a shadow kind of, but this one is kind of literally a shadow, whereas a form shadow is kind of it's not cast in the same way. It's a shadow that's sort of falling across a form based on the form itself, not based on sort of something blocking it from the light. So the other thing which kind of comes into play, I'm just going to use this kind of image, which is for a sort of a card game, and that I did. And the other concept that I think is important to kind of get your head around is the concept of sort of, and I'm just going to kind of call it ambient occlusion, because I think that's kind of, it's like a bit of a 3D graphics sort of term that might have sort of come into vogue. But basically it's the word itself is quite descriptive. It's that basically there's a lot of ambient light in a scene, which means that light is kind of coming from everywhere all the time. Everything's kind of bouncing light off it, and light rays are going everywhere. And there's kind of particles in the air, there's the sky, there's the ground. All of these things kind of naturally going to reflect light and kind of increase the amount of light in the scene, because light is kind of bouncing off everything. And the easiest way to kind of think about this is, if you shine a light in, a really bright room, you have sort of, something like one of those really shiny kind of white, like an Apple store or something like that, where everything's kind of bright. It all looks kind of bright. There's lots of light in there. If you have a really dark sort of black walls and stuff, maybe like a club or something, it's always going to sort of reflect less light. There's going to be less sort of light in there. Maybe if you've got sort of red curtains or some much more sort of moody decor, then the kind of general environment is going to be less light. Less light is kind of bouncing off objects, because dark objects don't reflect as much light as light objects do. Not because dark objects sort of are dark and therefore it's just literally that whatever it is in dark objects that makes them dark means that they're kind of absorbing more light. They're not reflecting as much light. So because they're dark, they don't reflect light. It's kind of it's the same thing. You can't get a dark object that is kind of that's giving off light. That's just not how it works. So there's light going everywhere, but we have this thing called ambient occlusion, which is basically where light, like ambient light, is occluded. And the simplest way to think about this is kind of something like an ear, right? Like the outside of an ear is, let's see if I don't know whether I have an image of an ear, but if you can just sort of imagine in your mind like the image of an ear, and you've kind of got the cavity in your ear, which kind of goes down to your inner ear, which lets you hear stuff. That's kind of dark, and that's because as you get into smaller spaces, just like little grooves and creases, like underneath that little cube, I was drawing that line. Basically, light rays have a harder time kind of reaching in there and bouncing around and then bouncing back to your eye. It's a lot harder for them to reach those places because they're kind of confined physically. So if we've got areas like kind of around here under this guy's sort of arm, they're going to be a lot sort of darker than other areas. And, for instance, like between fingers is another area where you're probably getting some sort of ambient occlusion. And if you think about it, sort of, if we just sort of, like, you remember that first box that we did where it's just kind of flat, if we kind of don't consider these extra concepts of sort of how light works, everything kind of looks a bit flat. But if you look for this in nature, you'll see it all the time. There's kind of little lines under things, just, where there's a crack, if there's sort of a crack in a cupboard or between the door, and where there's a line there. Well, why is there a line there? Two surfaces are kind of the same. Why is there a black mark there? And it's because you can kind of see there's a small crease there. Light has trouble getting there. And that's why they're dark. The reason this is important, I think, is because often when we first begin to try rendering things with form and tone, is that we kind of are really afraid of putting black marks around the place, and kind of pushing that. And it can really ruin something to put too much sort of, like really dark colors in there. And we're like, well, there wouldn't be any light there because the light's coming from here, and why would it get darker? So basically, where things are kind of a bit more hidden from the light, less light gets there progressively, and it just kind of works like that. And, you can see this if you play with a lot of those reflections, because basically what's happening is it's harder and harder for light to get in there. So if we just kind of illustrate this simply as I can, I'm going to use kind of opposite. We imagine that the light is kind of blue. We've kind of got light over here. Kind of got some sort of light over here, and we've got sort of light here, and there's plenty of like ambient light that's hitting this from everywhere. But once we sort of get in here, we've got this sort of shadow. Basically it's going to be like harder for it to get in here, and even as we go here, it's kind of, this light is going to kind of bounce off these surfaces which are not lit, and it's going to get sort of darker and darker and darker sort of as it goes there. So there's going to be less sort of light here because these surfaces are a bit sort of removed from the light. Less light is getting to them. than, you know, everywhere else. So that's a fairly simple way of explaining it, but that is just one of those. It's a very logical, if you think about how light works, and if you just study the box sort of stuff, you'll understand, well, that's just an extrapolation of the simple light rays and where they go and how they get into things. But it is very important, and it's especially important to understand if you're trying to get something that's kind of real. But, you know, it's also important to understand when you are trying to render something that's maybe perhaps abstract, you know, like comic book art or something around there, where you've got a lot of blacks and lines, and really often what lines are doing is that they're tracing the edges of forms, and they're trying to show where that form starts and where it finishes. And they're also often tracing and marking out those little bits and pieces where ambient light is occluded. So those are two sort of basic concepts which are really important. Just going to close this one. And we can probably get rid of this one as well. All right. So how do we go about actually physically rendering one of these cubes? I think there's basically two ways. One is through sort of and the first is kind of what I was doing previously, which is kind of using Photoshop and the power of Photoshop. And what using the tools in Photoshop means is that basically we are doing things like masking off. If you press L and you've got a lasso tool, then I can kind of paint. If I choose B for brush, and you know, I'm just on a layer here, and I've kind of made a little mask, and I can kind of paint in this mask, and nothing's going to go outside it. So that's a tool that can be useful. The other one is sort of, I can use these line tools for perspective. I can also use them, you know, as you were seeing, I can use them to draw sort of, you know, edges of faces and make them brighter or darker, put little lines underneath things. Also, if you use a brush, you can use things like an airbrush. Airbrush is really good for creating gradients. And, you know, these tools really make it very simple. And so all an airbrush is just a simple brush with the hardness sort of turned right down. So just simple round brush. And this just allows us to kind of, you know, as you were seeing, say if I made a selection of a face, and, you know, I can kind of then create these sort of gradients and things. The other thing is that I can use the marquee tool, which is M, and I can draw circles. And if you're trying to draw sort of, you know, clean lines in perspective, you know, I can stroke that. Again, right click if you've got a selection, stroke it, choose what color, what pixel size you want, and then I can, you know, sort of move this around. And, you know, potentially if I go Control T, which gives me transform, I can kind of move it around, do whatever. So that these are kind of ways that I can manipulate sort of graphic shapes. So yeah, those are kind of, you know, the sort of things that we use when I'm talking about Photoshop. We're using the tools of Photoshop to make things easier. Now, this is exactly what someone would do if they were trying to create these kind of realistic gradations and stuff, and, you know, complex shading, is that they would use things like masks, where, you know, you would cut out some paper and use things like an airbrush or sort of some chalk that you've ground up, and you can kind of smudge around with a smudger or a bit of tissue or something. There's lots and lots of ways that you can create gradients that is not that are kind of not you just getting a pencil or some kind of brush and doing this old thing where we kind of, let's get one that actually will give me a gradient, and sort of trying to go like, oh, this is black and I'm going to shade and I'm going to like decrease the opacity of this. So this is kind of what you would be doing if you were doing it traditionally with pencil. But people, you can certainly do that, but and we'll do one like this later, and this is basically the other sort of technique, is just kind of paint it. But it's important to note that despite all of these things being perhaps like, if you're thinking of them as like, oh, that's a bit cheap because that just lets me draw a circle or whatever, keep in mind that people who are drawing a lot of perspective have a full set of ellipse templates, which will cost you quite a bit of money to get a really good set. And what that is, in case you don't know what this kind of stuff is it's a plastic template, and it's got every kind of ellipse that can possibly exist for like little circles, small circles, whatever. So it's a full set of little flexible plastic sheets, and it has just different ellipses, and the angle of the ellipse is written there. And there might be, I don't know, multiple, like more than, maybe like, how many is in a set? Maybe 10 or more, something like that, in a really kind of high-end set. And typically if you're a draftsman before computers could do this, this is exactly how you would do it. You would get an ellipse, and you might kind of sketch it first, but when you were doing your inking, you'd always use an ellipse guide. And the other thing you would maybe use is like a French curve. If you've ever seen like a French curve, it's kind of like, might look, I don't know what it looks like, but there's a sort of a different series of, and I'm just completely making this up. Anyone who's actually used French curves would be like, oh, that's not a French curve. But there's a set of kind of different shapes that you can buy. And again, these come in a set, they're plastic. And what this does is it lets you kind of use these, and you would maybe like do a sketch or something. But if you want to ink a finished line around a certain curve, you would kind of try and rotate these curves until you get something that you want, and then you would kind of ink it. So it doesn't really matter sort of what technique or process you use. Every single time, people are going to try and make it as easy as possible for them to create sort of artificial shapes, which are very tricky to render. So yeah, don't worry too much about it being cheating or whatever. Mostly this has to do with learning all the different techniques that you can use to kind of solve a problem, to get a gradient where you want, get a line where you want, get whatever way you want it to be. That's really the trick. So if we think we've got this kind of standard thing, if we've got sort of Photoshop, got Photoshop, the other option is that we can just paint it. So using Photoshop to render these things would be, again, like you kind of saw me there, I'm using the full set of different techniques and stuff. And I think, again, it's really important, and eventually I think everyone should figure out how to use all these little tricks and tips, and I'll show you some of them to kind of render a cube. But it's important to also just understand kind of how to build up a painting with without worrying about that stuff too much, so that we're not kind of trapped by a whole bunch of layers and techniques and filters and bits and pieces, and it's sort of impossible for us to actually just sort of render something without it. So each will give you a different look. Using Photoshop will obviously give you a much crisper look, but if you're painting something and you want a more painted look, we're not trying to sort of create the most artificial looking realistic cube possible. We're maybe trying to get something that's a bit more naturalistic. It's important to know kind of how to use both of those tools. So let's have a go at sort of rendering just a simple cube using those different techniques. So I'm just going to kind of hide the stuff that we were talking about, and now what I'm going to do is just go back and have another go at creating some cubes, sort of refresher from perspective. And I've got a grid here. This is a really good grid to use to practice rendering, because the horizon line is well above the horizon line is well above the page. It's kind of, up here, and we've got a very naturalistic sort of looking grid going on. So again, I'm just going to kind of guess for the moment. Sort of measuring these faces. I'm not going to make it exactly a cube. And again, it's kind of, this is probably not the, the most accurate. But we'll see how we go. So this is kind of a sketch for the cube. And if I'm going to start with kind of this concept of using Photoshop as much as possible to utilize all its potential, I'm just going to try and move it above here. Or lower the opacity of these guys so they're not showing up quite so much, because they're getting a bit distracting. So check out the Photoshop Fundamentals DVD if you're interested in learning, every single little feature of Photoshop. I'm going to do my best to explain kind of what I'm doing. So I've created on a layer a sketch. It's kind of more or less accurate perspective. I've used the line tool, which is U, and it's U, but if you've got tools up, you might need to click, hold, and go down to line tool, just to make sure that you've actually got it. And then we can just draw lines, and all I do is I hold and go to a different point. What you can do is, if I hold down space while I've drawn a line, I can move it around. And you can always rotate from the initial point. So this does make it quite easy for me to sort of place a line and kind of draw it, kind of get it exactly where I want. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a selection using the lasso tool, and then I'm going to use that to kind of help me. This is going to become a mask, which means I'm not going to sort of paint outside the edges. So I might feather the edge of this a bit, but it really doesn't matter sort of what's going on there. What I'm going to do is you can basically just draw a line, and then everything kind of in the middle of the line is sort of going to become selected. And to get straight lines here, what you do, this is a bit sort of trickier, you start sort of drawing a line, and then you hold down Alt or equivalent on your Mac, and you take your sort of finger off the mouse or your Wacom off the Wacom tablet, and then you can kind of move it around. And I'm just going to keep holding Alt, and then every time I click, it's going to be a lot like the sort of line tool, where every time I sort of click, it's going to give me this point and another point, and I can kind of drag it anywhere, and that's going to create this kind of selection. Oh, I've got kind of feather on there, which is making it a bit weird. I don't think I'll use quite that much of a feather. So yeah, what I do is I'm clicking there at a point, and then I'm holding down Alt, and now I'm still holding down Alt, and I'm just clicking around at each of those points, or where I think those points will be. And when you're kind of done, I can just kind of click close. I take my finger off Alt, and then I release the kind of the mouse button, basically. So this has got, if we go into Quick Mask, if you press Q, then this is going to show us kind of roughly what the selection is going to look like. There you can kind of see, that's kind of what we got. Yeah, it looks okay. What I might do is, let's create a new layer. You create a new layer here, or layer, new layer. And what I'm going to do is, and this is where it becomes a bit tricky, but you can kind of just fill that layer, sort of edit, fill. But and you know that'll be kind of fine, and then you've kind of got this shape here. But there's things we can do. For instance, we can kind of what I can do is I can use that selection and create a mask. So I hit this button here, just kind of create this sort of layer mask. And what this means is that now I do have this sort of you can see if I hide the mask is no longer applying. Let's get an airbrush. Now if I paint in here, you know, you can see it's kind of going everywhere. Or if I, you know, delete this, I can delete what's on that layer. But let's turn the mask on, and now if I paint in that layer again, it's only going to go where that mask is letting it. And same way, if I kind of delete that, I can still go and sort of paint whatever color I want in there. So that's really useful, as you can see. And there's a number of ways you can kind of break up the selections for this. But what I'm going to do is start from a light color, right? Again, I'll explain how to pick values when I do the next demo. Or maybe I'll do it now. I'm just going to pick sort of, okay, I want it to be like a white cube. Let's say it'll be sort of 90% white. So that's the white cube, right? And I'm going to render this white cube and try and make it look white. So we don't have any shadow casting yet. So let's maybe add some shadow casting. Go back to 50% gray, which is what I had on this sketch. And I'm just going to cast, again, a very simple side lighting scheme. It's going to go through each of these points. Again, hold down space. Got the line tool, and I can kind of move it around. And if I hold down shift, it's going to lock it to being sort of, it locks it to kind of 90 degrees. You can see it's only going to go up at 90 degrees, sideways here, and it kind of won't go anywhere else. So I'm going to keep it there. I don't need to really draw this one in because I know it's going to go in the thing. And now I'll say, let's go for something like this. So I'm just drawing them pretty much sort of parallel. All right, and we're going to go from this point to this one, and then over to here. So we got almost kind of down lighting happening. Or maybe I'll twist it over a bit so we got a bit more of a dynamic look. Again, you've got to think about sort of your making sure the form is kind of well differentiated. All right, so now we're going from here to here to here. So just using line tool, fairly simple. So now we got our white cube. So I've got this on a layer. Let's think about putting the shadow in. So I've got this, I'm going to create another layer underneath this. And so that means that, okay, I've got a, I can paint underneath this cube, and the cube is always going to be on top. That's kind of how layers work, simple stuff. And you might think, well, okay, how am I going to draw this? You know, could I use this? I'm just going to, again, use the same sort of technique. I've got lasso, and again, I'm kind of going a little bit. This line was here, but I'm making sure I'm going from the edge of the actual object. So I'm just going to put this selection behind the box, and let's make it a shadow. But how do we pick what value to make the shadow? Well, you can kind of eyeball it. You know, you can sort of guess, and that's essentially kind of what it comes down to is sort of guessing. But we don't really have to guess. There's a lot of ways to kind of figure it out. And one way is to think about a concept which I've kind of heard of that really helped me a lot when it came to break this stuff down. And that's kind of halfway to black. So if we think of, we've got like a gradient, right? From sort of black to white. Let's go like that. So I've got black here, white here, right? And a gradient. So everything in between. So something really good to think about is to kind of break these down into separate values. And if you're working with markers, this is kind of really easy because you kind of often have 10 markers in there if each got a name. But if you're mixing paints, it's good to kind of break them down so you kind of have a concept of what's happening. And when you're painting digitally, it's also useful to kind of break them down a bit, just so you can have a good idea of sort of where you're going to arrange your values and sort of understanding these. There's a lot of sort of interesting stuff that can be said and done once we sort of break values up. So if we think about kind of the black value is sort of number 1. And this works in Photoshop as well if you use the HSB sliders. If you've got color up here, and we change the color palette to HSB. We've got hue, which is the color, the type of color. Saturation, which is how bright and saturated, you know, whether it's like really, you know, flame red, bright red, or whether it's kind of a muddy gray pastel red. And balance is the value. So if we got both of these, the hue, like the saturation is sort of 0. So there's no actual color, and we've just got black and white. That's 100% over there, which is white. And this is 0%, which is black. So 0% is black. Let's go to the next one, which is 10. And go to, let's try it. What I might do is kind of do 50. Otherwise, I might kind of end halfway. The scale might just not be the right size. Got 40 kind of over here. 30. and 20. So try and make it kind of breaking down that scale into different swatches. And then we've got sort of 60. 70, 80, and 90. And then we've got sort of 100% white. So think about these as being sort of numbered in your head. So we've kind of got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. We've got 1, 2, 3. That's 0. Okay, this will be kind of 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So 5 is at 50, 0 is black, 10 is white. You can do it the other way. 0 can be white. It's really irrelevant. What's important to understand is kind of that we can kind of break this down. And certainly if you were rendering with pencil and stuff, this would make a lot more sense. But it's good. It's a good sort of base to start with. So the concept of halfway to black is that a really good place to start with a shadow value is to consider the local color that's kind of just lit. If as if that color is kind of receiving full light, which is, say, like this is a white box, if it was just kind of lit from all sides with the kind of light that we're using. So this is kind of a local color, right? This is what the object is, if it's red or sort of green or white or whatever it is, if it might have a texture or a pattern or something, that's kind of the local color, local sort of, that's the color it is. Whereas, the shadow value might sort of change. And certainly if the lighting is maybe a different color, that might change this. But we have to first think about the local color. What's the color and value of the thing when it's just kind of lit by a neutral light, to start with. So we've got this local color, which is 90%, which is kind of here, right? And a good place to start with the shadow is to say, let's start with halfway from 90 to black. And halfway from 90 to black is 45, or kind of halfway between 4 and 5. So what you can do if you're doing a pencil thing is to kind of maybe try and sort of render halfway and then kind of, use that. So let's start with the shadow though, because that's kind of where I was. If we take this color, which is 33%, or kind of around here on this scale, what's halfway to black from 30 is 1.5 or 15. So if we slide this slider here, we're going to get 15% or 1.5 or somewhere in the middle here, kind of around there. And that's the value that I'm going to start there. So I've got this on a layer, and what I'm going to do is lock the transparency of it, and I'm going to go Alt backspace, which is going to fill, and that's just going to make this color 15% or 14%. Again, it doesn't have to be to the percentage point, but just roughly that will kind of get you there. So yeah, we've got that going on, and what that means is that generally, if you put all these values together, it'll kind of look right. The values will be relating to each other nicely. And if you use the same rule in your scene, the relationship between a shadow and a local color will be consistent. And that's really the key, is that they're consistent within a scene. And also the difference between black colors and light colors will be consistent. And what you'll see is kind of, something which is, again, one of the many kind of rookie mistakes that's right up there is having too much contrast between the light and dark colors for dark objects, because what you can see when we think about halfway to black, and this is, the world kind of does work this way, is that the sort of difference in value between, in terms of percentage points, between a dark color and its shadow, so we got that's at 33%, we've got kind of, if we go halfway to black, we're at 15%, which is only sort of 15 percentage points less. So it's not that much darker. But this cube here, right, which is white, let's tackle this now. So let's think about this face of the cube, which is going to be like pretty much in shadow. I'm just going to lower the opacity of this a little bit so I can see the points, and then I'm going to trace on top of this layer another face of this cube. So I'm going to go somewhere around here, scroll down, go like this, off the page here. So what's here doesn't matter because I'm going to, again, create a mask. And I'm going to fill what's behind that mask with, see if you can do the math. Let's put this back up. This is 90%. What's halfway to black from 90%? About 45%. So I'm again going to go, let's do it over here. Oh, probably should have thought about that more. That face does in fact matter. But I've got another selection for it, so I can get rid of it. So what I did there is I took the selection from here, and I used it to modify the mask here. But if you're doing this, then probably the best thing to do is to just kind of select that as accurately as you can. The other thing we could do is we could use this layer here as a base. So let's do that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to select, let's go into quick mask and see what I've selected. I've selected this box here. I'm going to invert that selection, and then I'm going to delete. So what we've got here is I have this masked off, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to lock the transparency because I really don't need this to change. And what I'm then going to do is I'm going to clip this layer to this layer. So again, there's lots of ways to do this in Photoshop. I'm trying to show you like all the different little tricks you can use just so you kind of know that they're there, but it's better to just do it as procedurally as possible. So let's have another go at that. I've now got, this is just a cube. Let's take away the mask, and it's just kind of a cube. But what I've done this time is I've locked the transparency, and that means all the pixels on this layer that don't have any color value on them, I can't paint on it. So even if we delete the layer mask now, I've locked that layer. I've locked the pixels. You can lock other aspects of it, but this one locks the transparent pixels. Means now when I paint on it, I can't go outside the lines. I can't go outside the edge of it. So this is kind of useful because now let's have another go at that. So again, you can do this all sorts of different ways, but the way I'm doing it now is a little bit better. because it's going to let me edit things a bit better. So let's have another go. Go over here, and I'm going to create another layer, and I'm going to do this again where we've got, I want 45% because we've got this which is at 90, and then I'm going to make it 45%. So let's fill. Now I've got this again, but it's okay because what I can do is I can clip this layer, which is this face, to this bottom layer. And you do that by holding Alt or the Mac equivalent, and you position your cursor between two layers, and when you click, it'll clip the top layer to the bottom layer. And what that means is that I'm using the transparent pixels here, and basically anything on the layer that's clipped to this bottom layer, I kind of can't see where the transparent pixels are. It's kind of one of those things. You've just got to play around with it. Once you kind of see how it works, you'll see how it works. And there is a detailed explanation of this in the Photoshop Fundamentals video. So anyway, now I've got this face. All I need now is to kind of, and this is again, what I've done is I've just picked that value, and it's giving me a fairly good representation of what this value might look like in shadow. But I need to differentiate this face. So where do you think it will be? Now the lighting is quite high here, so I think it's actually going to be a little bit closer to this value than halfway. So it has to be somewhere between 45%, which is the shadow, and 90%. So if we were to go halfway, then that would be sort of, what's 5 plus, sort of like 60, 65, something like that. You can also visually kind of see the difference, you know, like if you're on the sliding scale and you're at 50%, like what's halfway between, you can just physically see on the slider where halfway is. But yeah, it's going to be sort of somewhere around 60. But I think it's going to be a bit darker than that. So I'm going to pick just a plain 60 and we'll see how we go. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create another layer, and I'm going to create it, and I'm going to clip it to this layer as well. And you can move these layers around. I'm going to put it underneath this layer, and that's going to let me do this. So, maybe I'm not 100% sure what I want. I'm like, maybe I should fiddle around with that. Maybe I should change the value here. Let's get rid of our guides because we really don't need that stuff anymore. It's just gonna kind of mess us up. Let's move this a little bit away, and what I might do is hide the guides. But keep this stuff just so it's a bit easier to look at. So simple cube. I've kind of got these different layers. The power of Photoshop now is that all of these things are on separate layers, and let's make these let's go large thumbnail so you can actually have a better chance of seeing the different layers and stuff here. So you can see where it's checkerboard, that's a transparent pixel. Transparent is basically means there's nothing on the layer. It's just a clear layer with these little things here, which are not transparent. That's the actual object. So I've got these separate things. And what I can do now is actually use a bunch of Photoshop's manipulation tools to change any of these faces. So for instance, if I wanted to change this face and say, let's see what happens if I make it 1% darker or 1% lighter. What I could do is sort of change the value here and kind of fill again, so I could fix the transparency of this so that I can fill it, because otherwise there's different ways you can do it, but this is the best way to do it, is to fill. And I could kind of fill like that, but I think that's just going to be fiddly. So we don't need to do that. What I can do is I can go Control and press U. And what this brings up is the image adjustments, hue saturation. And you can see here I've got a lightness thing. And I can change this slider and it's going to make that color or that object darker or lighter. You can see it's updating. If it was a color, I could then change the sort of different hue and saturation of that color. So this lets me kind of go and sort of dial in, like, exactly where is it? Like, what is kind of happening here? So I think maybe something like that. So I made it a little bit darker. Right, so I've got the basics, and this is kind of where you saw me before with the previous sort of box tutorial. Now, what I can use are basically those same tools that I was using before, which was, I've just got a big airbrush, and I can just lock the transparency of these, or I could put a mask on them. And what this will let me do is just get a big airbrush, and I can always sort of paint. If you use eyedropper, hold down if you're in brush mode, press Alt to select an eyedropper. Now I can just paint to my heart's content, whatever color or whatever in here, and I never have to worry about these edges, because when you're painting, edges are actually really tricky. It's quite difficult to kind of maintain those edges, and we'll see that in a minute. So this is a very powerful tool, and you can see it's a lot of fiddling around and kind of messing around with layers, but once you get used to it, these things will kind of be will feel a lot more natural, I think. So again, we can go through a similar process, I'm going to imagine. This light is going to be sort of quite, I think maybe it might be a little bit sort of darker, because this is really, it's really kind of coming from the top, this light. So we're not going to be getting quite as much bounce light, I don't think. Oh no, we might, but it might be sort of more from the bottom. Anyway, it's probably the only way to really know is to kind of get some white cubes and have a look. So again, I'm just going to use this sort of airbrush technique and see what I can do. But, you know, we can also use, we can be lazier than that and use other aspects of Photoshop. So you could use a gradient tool and kind of get, you know, like a very smooth gradient. Lots of different things you could do to play around with this, but I'm just going to use the airbrush because it's kind of simple. A selection and your ability to kind of use like a big airbrush is very powerful in Photoshop. And you can see that, you know, just if you look at airbrush art, you know, old school airbrush art, people create amazing effects just because they've got masks which define where is going to be a hard edge and where is going to be a soft edge. And really art is often just about creating hard and soft edges. Again, we're talking about that concept of cast shadow versus form shadow. You know, one is kind of soft, one is hard. You really need these two contrasts to create good form. So again, I'm selecting this one, and you can see because, you know, I could potentially put, you know, have all sorts of nonsense going on here, but because these other layers are above it, they're kind of hiding each other, and we get this kind of effect where I can paint on all these separate layers without them affecting each other. Now, obviously, when you're painting complex objects in an actual painting, it's not possible to do this. You know, you know, because it would, you know, you can't make every single thing on separate layers. I mean, people do, but I certainly couldn't be bothered painting like that. I think it's counterintuitive. But just for doing this is really helpful, because what we want is to set up a little box like this, and you might recast the shadow, but essentially, this isn't about perspective. It's not about that drawing. It's just about playing around with the rendering and trying different things. So the closer you can get to not having to worry about that, the better. And that's why it's good to kind of set this up like this initially. So the other thing we did before, which might sort of help us to get somewhere, is kind of start to shade the background a bit. And again, what I'm trying to do is get some nice contrast going. So we've got some black against this edge here, and you can see there's a little bit of a kind of mistake. What I might do is try and kind of fill that up. Yeah, no, it's made it worse. Got to be very careful. See if I can do it. I think it was done with the lasso. Yeah, it's still looking a bit messy. I'll leave it there. It's kind of, it's okay. That'll have to do. Lock transparency of that again. So just turn the transparency off so I could sort of change the shape of it. What's another thing I could do? I can create another layer here as I was, and I could either create a line like this on top, shift it around. Make sure it's actually going directly down there. And then I can kind of maybe erase some of it because I don't need it to be that sharp, but having some sort of little mark there might be good, or you could just sort of paint it in. And you can see again last time go back to airbrush. Need to play around with the shadow a bit. Oh. So again, because everything's on separate layers, and I've organized this file kind of just because I've organized it. No, it's not necessarily organized well, it's just organized. Yeah, doing these little sort of playing around with these things is a lot more fun. It's less kind of arduous and like, oh, now I've got to change this and fiddle around with it. That's really the key. That the key is to kind of get to a point where you're not kind of bothered by making little changes and fiddling around with stuff, because that's kind of should be fun. That should be an enjoyable part of sort of learning how to render. It should be like, oh, let's fiddle around with this one and make this a little bit lighter, a little bit darker. So yeah, in this scenario, I'm just fiddling around with airbrush stuff, doing exactly the same stuff as before. And we've got maybe a little bit sort of lighter here. Again, often like very subtle little changes. Again, I kind of showed you that, you might kind of get a little bit of reflection kind of off the box. And it's just a matter of kind of doing as much observation as kind of possible. You can see that this is kind of where my observation kind of runs out. And, I'm like, this looks probably as the same as the other box. It's still, I still think there's some things which could be, like a bit better about it. Put to zoom out, always have a good view of it, see what's kind of happening. Yeah. So anyway, this is using sort of Photoshop tools to the largest degree possible. But what if we don't want to use Photoshop tools? And I really suggest that, having trying in different ways might be really useful too, because simply just because if you don't know how to use Photoshop, then it's kind of a pain. It's a block to have to kind of fiddle around with this and learn it. So I've got this kind of perspective that I've done. I'm going to make it really kind of faint, or as faint as possible. On top, I'm going to set it to kind of maybe screen, something like that. I'm going to keep this kind of gradient thing because I think that might become useful. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to try and paint it. And the way that you do this is just kind of think about, and this is why having a value scale and understanding what kind of values should go where, is that frequently when you're building up a painting, it's hard to kind of see how it's going to look until you've blocked it in. And so getting to a point where it's blocked in, where you see in Photoshop where I've got these different layers are kind of just kind of chucked in there roughly, and I can see right, I can see where the light's coming. Now I can make these subtle adjustments, and I can make them in a way that's going to be efficient and actually change things, and I can see it come alive like in front of me. Whereas, if I'm kind of starting, somewhere here and I'm kind of rendering away, it's hard to see what it's going to look like. So having a good idea, like getting this kind of halfway to black thing down, and just kind of, and this does apply if there's color as well, it's just about the value aspect of it. Just having this down and being able to kind of quickly get those values in there and then be able to fiddle it around is really important, because blocking in is a massive part of art. It's just being able to get those values in there quickly. So in this demo, I might go the other way. I might start from dark and I might go light. So in this case, let's pick 30. And I'm going to say this cube, like the darkest bit of this cube, and it's a bit close to the background. Let's make it maybe 2. Maybe it's going to be a dark cube this time. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to kind of block it in. And I'm going to use just this brush pretty much, which is kind of a pastel-y sort of brush. I've got the shadow there, so I'm going to put some of that there. So this is going to be the... well, let's try and do like a really black cube. We'll see how that works out. It might fail utterly. We'll see. We'll have to see. But that way you can kind of see how this works, the basics of it, and see how this halfway to black thing kind of changes different values. So, what is the background? The background is still 31. So this shadow color is still at kind of 15%. So I'm going to put that in. And when you're blocking in or painting, often a lot of it is about sort of managing your edges. And I'm going to try and get these edges sort of right, and sort of figuring out like what I'm going to paint when, and at what point I'm going to kind of define what edge, and just kind of getting that down. So I'm kind of just putting this everywhere now because because this brush itself is not good at getting in here. It's not good at getting in these little, if this was a white cube, it's not good at making those marks, and I can see that. But, painting traditionally, we don't necessarily have to create an edge just by kind of painting it, like drawing it. We can, especially, when you've got Photoshop and you can, opaquely just go over and get any color anywhere. I can now sort of get this edge, and I can create it this way because this brush is fine at creating these kind of straight lines. So this is the distinction. This is why I'm kind of doing it the way I'm doing it, in case it's a bit weird. So I've kind of got the shadow there. And now what I want to do is maybe I'll just make this, this will be the actual sort of color, and we'll go halfway to black from sort of 20, so maybe down to like 10. And this is going to be on this side of things. So this object is in shadow here. All right, and again, we had this concept of here we figured out it's kind of, it's a bit halfway, but it's kind of a bit on the darker side. So I've got dark is at sort of 10%, light is at 20. Really this dark should be a little bit lighter than that, sort of 11% somewhere there. But this is all right. That'll be fine. So somewhere in between. So in between would be like 15, 16. In between would be 16. But I'm going to make it 13. What's 13 look like? And keep in mind that I know I'm going to have to fiddle around with this a bit, and create all those gradients. Yeah, maybe a little bit lighter. Let's make it some sort of 14. Especially down the bottom, because I know there'll be sort of some reflected light down the bottom. So I'm just kind of blocking it in. So let's zoom out and we can see kind of what's happening. Looks okay. So you can see, even though I've got a bunch of sort of messy edges everywhere, it's starting to, I can still see some form in there. So what I'm going to do is reduce the opacity of these lines even more, because I think now they're just getting in the way. But it's important to be able to see them a little bit. So just enough to see them, but yeah. So it's really, obviously if I combine this technique with, sort of some lasso work, that might be really effective. And, obviously you can combine these, and certainly that's where probably the best techniques come from, is not some sort of simple, I'm just painting it with one brush and that's it, because I'm better than everyone else and I'm not going to use any tricks or tips or anything like that. But it's important to know how to do it both ways. So I'm gonna show you kind of how to go about thinking about it. So again, this brush is quite fine at sort of creating these straight lines. So that's what I'm going to use it as. And I'm not going to be too picky about trying to get really sort of nice, clean brush strokes. What I'm going to focus on is, I think I still had it selected there a bit, but yeah, what I'm going to focus on is making sure it looks like the light is working. Because that's really what's important. And what you'll find is that if a general rule that I find is if your values are right, and it'll look kind of like there's light in there and like everything's working. And the other thing that will frequently happen is that the brush strokes themselves will cease to matter. You'll stop seeing brush strokes quite as much, and you'll start to sort of see form. You'll just kind of see your brush strokes will modify the form. Whereas if your values are off, if you've gotten this block in wrong, then no matter what you kind of do, it's always going to look a bit sort of weird and incorrect, and you'll be just looking at brush strokes and trying to get them to go away and be like, oh, I need to keep rendering and smooth this out. Generally, especially when you look at really expert painters, the brush strokes are quite abstract, but because the values are on and the form is on and everything's kind of working, it just looks really nice. And you kind of don't notice the strokes. And that's really the beauty of painting, is when you're not noticing the strokes. So again, it's important that this line, as you saw before, is quite accurate, because I'm still painting a geometric form. I'm trying to paint it with paint, but not with paint, but with a slightly more painterly technique. And the key here really is just to have a go first at just getting that block in right. Make sure the edges are working. Again, this might be a lot more complicated if you had a more complicated subject. Really, this sort of thing is quite easy to paint. But if you do have to pay attention to these little edges and stuff. They've got to be straight. And this is where having this grid and kind of underdrawing helps, But it's, this one's never going to look as crisp as the other rendering, obviously. That's just the nature of the technique. And we probably don't want it to. Something else that's interesting to notice here is that the shadow is not darker than the object. And that's because the shadow color has nothing to do with the object that's casting the shadow. It has everything to do with the object that it's casting onto. It's very important to understand. It's kind of obvious when we look at it and we break it down this way, but again, it's sort of one of those things that's a bit sort of hard to get your head around. If you're kind of in the middle of painting, and it's 3 a.m. and you're on a deadline trying to complete an assignment or create something, and it's like, but really, is that darker than the thing? Okay. So I've got that roughly in there. I'm just gonna hide that for a bit and kind of start to let it sit on its own. I'm just gonna get rid of some of this stuff in the background, because I had this kind of big gradient going, so every time I kind of paint into it, it's going to look a bit sort of funny. And what I might do is kind of make some of those gradients a bit more brushy and a bit less kind of airbrushy. Oh. So that I'm not sort of fighting the gradient every time I put a brush stroke down. And I can come and smooth those out later. Right, back to the cube. So again, a little bit of selection tools and that kind of stuff would come in super handy right now, but I'm just going to, and that's my natural instinct, because I've kind of done it. It's like, I could just select a few of those edges, make them really straight, make it look a lot better. So let's try applying some of the logic that we were thinking about before. So changing all those little subtleties and making all that stuff work. But so there's different ways you could do this, right? I could kind of keep painting the way I'm painting and just be very careful about the strokes that I'm choosing. And I think that would work quite nicely. You know, we could kind of go, oh, I'm going to go down 20%. I'm going to go, you know, here, and I'm going to paint this. But the problem is here is that I really run the risk of having to then go and like fiddle around with these edges again. So what I could have done is avoided this sort of detail and like getting those hard edges down until the very last minute. But another technique, which I think is a little bit more intuitive because it's perhaps more akin to if you have a pencil, which I think is like what most people are kind of, that's where most people are coming from, is like, I know how to use a pencil. And what you would do if you had a pencil is you would kind of just shade into it and, you know, constantly make it a little bit darker, a little bit lighter. So a really good way to do that in Photoshop is just to actually, I've got this brush, right? And I can adjust the opacity with it with my Wacom. But if I use the number keys or I adjust the opacity here with the slider, what I can do, number keys are really easy because I can go like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 10 is 0, and that kind of changes the value. So I can maybe select like a 20%. And let's see what happens. What it's going to do is I'm basically painting very lightly. And if I paint again and again, it's going to build up. So this is a really good way to kind of just creep up on some of these values. So I'm going to maybe try to get some of the stuff that we were talking about before happening. I'm going to pick a slightly lighter value and see if I can pick off some of these edges just a little bit, make them a little bit brighter so they're kind of coming off the page a bit more. And the other thing is, let's start to think about our reflected light. So I'm just going to select this one as sort of a random just lighter color, and I'm just going to paint into it. Oh, it's a bit too much. So I've just got low opacity, and what this means is that I'm never going to do anything really silly. And what I can do is just kind of creep up on it and fiddle around with these values a bit. Painting back, painting in. So obviously if we look at this value, this is 20. This is sort of 17. So yeah, this is actually quite high level of sort of reflection, what we've got there already. So we don't want to go too much higher than that. And we might have a bit, again, of sort of reflected light here. Except for kind of here where we've got this sort of shadow. And again, some of the shadow might be getting a little bit darker because it's kind of getting some ambient occlusion around here. So you can see, again, this is a lot more fiddling around. But it's good to think about it because I think the more that if we kind of use this sort of technique, we're really sort of starting to think about like how this is put together. And probably if you can sort of do this, you can do it with pencil and paper, which is good to have the confidence to be able to sort of do this sort of rendering on pencil and paper. So let's think about a couple of other things. Maybe we could try and think about, again, this sort of line that's under here, created by a sort of ambient occlusion down the bottom. Casting a little shadow there. And the other thing we can do is say, well, you know, this shadow might not be 100% sort of flat like that. Might have some sophistication to it. And the same way, all I'm really doing is adding the same things as the same sort of drawing, but different technique. And the more you come at these sort of simple exercises from sort of different directions, I think that the more you'll kind of start to understand it. Going a bit too far there probably. So I'm just doing a lot of sort of like petting the line, kind of fiddling around. But it means that I can sort of, what's going to happen is that I'm going to sort of brain is going to start to think about it a bit more instinctively. All right. What's some other things that are going to be happening? I think for me, this line is actually a bit off. So I'm going to go back to kind of a higher opacity and see if I can get this kind of working a bit better. It just seems like maybe this line I put down here or something is kind of a bit off. Like it, yeah, it should be sort of more over here. Maybe there's just a bit of error with that initial sort of block in. See if we can fiddle around with it. Looks a little bit better. This one's kind of bowing out a bit too. And yeah, I don't know, that looks kind of all right to me. Let's think about this environment a bit more. Obviously it can't maybe we could kind of make this a bit more intense. I don't know how well this is going to work because it kind of works anyway. I don't really need to pop out that face. I don't think that's gonna help us a whole lot. I think it works like it is, but we might get a bit of just a tiny bit, again, not much, but a little bit of sort of reflected light down here coming off this object. Again, it might be a bit too much because this black object is not going to reflect that much light because dark objects just aren't reflecting light. That's why they're dark. But maybe if I just kind of define this edge a bit, we might get somewhere. So just thinking about this kind of putting a bit of sort of surface on here so it's not quite so floating. So again, this is just kind of, this is if you've got a pencil and you're just kind of rendering away, creating some texture, just, trying to sort of play around with it. And, if you want to kind of do it, as an actual sort of pencil, again, just pick a really small kind of thing, pick a small low opacity, and, we can just kind of punch things up maybe a bit higher. Start to create, some hatching or something like that. Again, the technique itself is not that important, and it's really it is important to understand that the real key is just to put the value in the right spot. Make sure your edges are kind of working, sort of how you do it is not that important. You know, you could do this with a round brush, whatever. And if you made the values right and look good, then it would look good. It's not going to matter. It's just about the fundamental sort of stuff. That's what makes things look real. You know, it's not kind of being able to draw and render, you know, really fancy gradations or whatever. It's just putting the value in the right spot and understanding kind of how light works. But yeah, anyway, this is kind of we've done enough of this. You certainly get the idea by now. So that's kind of how we just build up something from nothing, not using any tricks, no Photoshop messing around, no photos, no nothing, just starting somewhere and building it up. And the other techniques are obviously really important. And once you can combine them, then you're going to get the best of both worlds in every sense. But you can really see how this kind of concept of halfway to black plays out. Very important to understand when you're painting dark objects, especially if they're matte. You know, if it's a shiny black object, obviously like a shiny car, it's going to reflect lots of things. So it's going to be black, but it's also going to reflect, you know, the sky and stuff. So it's going to have all these highlights and reflections running across it. But a matte object that's black, something that's not reflecting, you know, it seems like these days a lot of stuff that's black is kind of reflective. But anyway, something that's matte and black, the differences between the values are quite small, and it's really important to get this subtlety right. And, you know, you can see if we went down lower, you know, it would almost get to the point where the difference between these values would be sort of like 2%, you know, and this thing would be so black and it would be reflecting so little light that you kind of couldn't tell what the different surfaces were. It would just kind of be black, you know. So yeah, look out for this sort of thing when you're just looking around the world and sort of understanding things, and because your brain recognizes, oh, that's black, and this is the top side, and this is the bottom side, and yeah, there's plenty of contrast here. Look at this. But in actual, you know, fact, if we compare this one, let's see if we can. Oh, you know what? Now I've kind of messed up, because if we turn this one back on, we're not going to have. This. So let me try and I'll put back in the. Yeah, we don't need those. Let's see if I can put back this big airbrush thing. Just so we can see them side by side and have a rough. You can see this is getting a little bit messed up because that was previously. Erase this so we can, bear with me for a sec, so we can get a nice kind of 1-2. So yeah, here we've got this guy and this one. There we go. So a different sort of way to render. Let's get a close up. One's black, one's white. And again, not 100% black, not 100% white, kind of, you know, but sort of close. And we're just using the same logic, same stuff that we were talking about in the previous lecture, but just applying it in different ways. So those are fundamentals of sort of how to actually go about rendering it once you know the rules of how light's supposed to work. And really the trick to getting good at this is combining those two things, combining your knowledge of light and how it works and your ability to render it, your understanding and mastery of the tools. The more you can combine those, the better. The quicker, the more loose and expressive your ability to represent and render the world and the world inside your head is going to be. So hopefully that's been a good sort of intro to rendering. Keen to see what you guys come up with when you tackle these assignments on your own.